to session 7 of our CrossWord series Bible study on the Sermon on the Mount. We're looking at Matthew 7, conveniently lines up with the session number finally. We're looking at Matthew 7 verses 1 through 12. So I hope you're ready. I know we've been spending a lot of time looking intensely at Jesus' kind of long sermon, but it covers a lot of ground. After looking at both the Lord's Prayer, and then last week Father Jordan looked a little bit about fasting and ambition, and a lot of personal teaching about how we can fully depend upon God. And we get even into a little more application of how we can do that daily, of how to live rightly following the Lord's command. And so we're coming down the home stretch here, and I think we'll get right into it. And looking at the first half of Matthew 7, verses 1 through 12, there's sort of two parts kind of stand out. In the first part, he begins with some practical advice. We see in verse 1, he says, "Don't judge others, so you won't be judged yourself." It's kind of similar to some advice that I heard in morning prayer recently from Ecclesiastes 19, which says, very simply, have you heard a word? Have you heard something? Let it die with you. I mean, the text and the tone is a little bit different than how we talk, but the idea remains the same. If you're given this advice to be brave and to not be afraid, he even uses the phrase, you won't burst, it's going to be okay if you just let the word or the secret that you heard or the conversation, let that rest with you. It's very simple. And here too in Matthew 7, it's very simple. If you aren't judging, then it's much easier that you won't be judged yourself. It's in the same section that we get the great advice of judge not lest ye be judged. That's the more elevated style. But then we have this idea of, don't pick the little sawdust out of your friend's eye because you've got a log stuck in your own head. All this advice sort of revolves around thinking the best of other people, and that's really powerful advice that we'll get into a little bit more in a moment. And that's the first part. The second part is sort of an encouragement to pray, and that's verses 7 through 12. And we find this beautiful phrase about seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened. Which is just, it's beautiful prose, but also it's really practical advice about, to earnestly pray and God will give you the good things. First, we'll look a little bit more at the text, starting in the first portion. Starting with not judging others, or with a measure, and the same will be measured back to you. Starting here, and in the following verses, sort of Christ prescribes how we can handle our interpersonal relationships to an extent, and this in turn informs our character. And one of the most powerful pieces of advice I got from one of my seminary professors, who was this wonderful old farmer from Nebraska who had lovely stories about cows and corn and stuff, and he impressed upon me and my class all the time about how the best way to be able to pastor and witness and to love people, it starts with thinking the best of them. And that's paramount. If you don't start there, then it's going to be much harder, if not impossible, to really love them. And so in assuming and presuming the good in someone, that allows you to have no doubt. And this establishes trust and a more godly filled mindset that opens us up to true Christian charity. This opens yourself up to live more carefree, unburdened by any sort of jaded cynicism or anything like that. But again, this doesn't mean to just ignore or not recognize if someone has any fault in them. But it does mean you don't assume that of them. You don't assume that person has some malicious intent. I think it's a caution to not pass judgment in any sort of sense of arrogant, or to think that you yourself couldn't do the same. Again, the phrase, "judge not lest ye be judged," sort of comes to mind. It's I think, really helpful advice if we really take it to heart, and it'll make our own lives easier and more peaceful. I find personally, if I go through different seasons where I find myself being more harsh or quicker to judge or critique just every little thing that comes my way, it's really kind of tiresome and just fills you with this negativity that makes it a lot harder to actually just be at peace. And that's a really dangerous trap to fall into. And all those sorts of living negatively or looking for opportunities to call out other people's failings is certainly not in Jesus' vision for Christian community. And the danger or concern here is somewhat grim, potentially, that if you're judging, that sort of presumes that you are fit to judge, that you're fit to be in the judgment seat, which we know only God can do. Because God is the only one that actually knows what is in people's hearts and minds and actually can judge rightly. And so instead of trying to be a judge, we're called to live humbly and charitably towards all we meet. Jesus continues in the next couple of verses, 3 through 5, and he starts to call out those that live as hypocrites. This is where we get the line about, why do you see the speck in your brother's eye when you've got a log in your own? And this is, again, a continuation of the first 2 verses of what that actually looks like and why it's kind of silly to try to be the one to judge others. As we are not fit to be judged like God, we're merely human, and we have many of our own faults. And I find it really humorous to kind of imagine what a sort of scene looks like of you trying to pick, this little speck of sawdust when you have a log sticking out of your eye. In theory, if you picture, like an actual wooden log sticking out, like, I don't know, you'd be like hitting him in the head or something, or it's obscuring your vision. And how do you think you could possibly do it with a log sticking in your head? It's kind of humorous, but the idea remains, the same in that, it is kind of absurd. And that's what Christ is sort of conveying, that it really is absurd for us to think that we have the ability or the character or the virtue to be able to rightly do that. Why would we deserve? What gives us the right or what qualifies us to do that? When our own nature is that of fallen and prideful and not perfect justice like God's own character. In the next verse, Jesus calls it like he sees it. He says, "You hypocrite." And this is a really strong word. It's a fun word to say, I think. And this is typically reserved for when Jesus is calling out scribes and Pharisees. We see this throughout in Matthew 23:15. I find this kind of humorous. He says, "Hey, you travel all the land and sea, and then you make one convert, and then you make him twice as much as a child of hell as you." Which I think is kind of strong language. But the idea that he uses hypocrite, not usually in a good sense, and so we should be wary of it. I mean, it pops up throughout Scripture, more than a dozen times in Matthew and several times in Luke, and then a bunch of other times in Job and Isaiah. But the idea is that, it's a common term for calling out people that are not living fully by the law, fully living into God's vision for the world, also known as a hypocrite. So here's a caution. I think it's a tough one because it's a natural and common human reaction to compare yourself to others. But it's this verse about hypocrites that is the most helpful advice. And in this portion, it's set up to do not do this, but do this instead. And that's the idea to not pay attention to your neighbor's faults or your spouse or your family, but do look inwardly at your own faults. Do recognize and see the log that is in your life, the log that is blocking your vision for seeing clearly what is around you. It's really hard, like I kind of joked about, it's hard to help a friend when your vision is blurred or, literally obstructed like a log. I mean, it's kind of a silly idea, but it's practically what's at play here. In the next moment, Jesus starts talking about, people acting like dogs and pigs. And at first this is somewhat odd because, he's been trying to tell us to speak and act more charitably towards people. And then he starts calling people literally dogs and pigs or swine. And that's a common enough term that's typically reserved for Gentiles within Jewish circles. And it's a very derogatory one. So it's not one that you would think would be used in a charitable way. And it's not. It's a strong language that, the reality is that Jesus is recognizing that humans can act like animals. That they can be so not right with what is, supposed to be being done, and actually following and listening and taking to heart the word. And this is what this verse is about here when he's talking about the dogs are going to trample down on the feet, on the mud, and the pigs are going to try to eat at the pearl, and they'll realize that it's not food, and they'll trample it into the mud. That they're not respecting what is holy and what is good. And so this is when he's speaking about how to share the gospel with everyone, which we know is a part of our Christian call. Obviously, in the Great Commission, we're called to preach the gospel to all nations. But here he's getting at sort of a special circumstance that if you can know that someone is going to so strongly refuse, or has already been given all these opportunities to hear the word, that you may change how you interact with them. Now, it's kind of analogous to if you know of a certain dangerous person that is around, that you would protect your child from them to an extent. You're not ignoring the reality of who these people are, and we're still asked to love them. We're asked to be patient. In this context of this image of the dogs being given holy food from the temple and pigs eating pearls and sort of stamping them on the ground, these animals have a certain reputation. And so why would you give what is holy, like the sacred food from the temple, or something special or precious, why would you give that to something that doesn't recognize or care about what is being put in front of them? There's a distinction here. Again, like what I mentioned about us being evangelists, and that we still are called to preach the gospel to everyone, to all nations. There's not a person alive or that has ever lived that is not worthy or deserving of hearing the gospel. It is our Christian duty to keep striving towards loving and serving others with patience and humility. And that's the first portion of Matthew 7. Here, looking to love others and think well of them, and how helpful that is in your daily life to change your posture towards everyone that you meet. It can really bring great peace and joy, and it makes it easier to love people. And the second section is about how we sort of position ourselves towards God and our own stance. This contains this famous line about seeking humbly that which is above, knock and the door will be opened. This is sort of a basic encouragement to keep praying. And we're asked throughout Scripture, and this comes towards the end of the Sermon on the Mount, it makes sense. So in any sermon that has a lot of teaching, that there should be some sort of point to give some advice of here's how you go do that now. Here's how do you practically do that. And that's what he has for us. He illustrates this with a somewhat humorous point, I think, in verses 9 through 11, in making the point that how a parent sort of interacts with a child, that if a child asks for bread, the parent that loves the child will not just give them a stone instead, or if they ask for fish, the parent isn't going to give them a serpent. That would be nonsense, because the parent loves. And that's sort of the dynamic between us and God, and that God is not going to give us something that is worse or harmful than what we actually ask for in prayer. I mean, I can kind of relate to this to an extent. When my son Henry asked for food, he's a big fan of applesauce, so he asks for it like 6 times a day, or really at any given moment, he's like, applesauce? Applesauce? And he knows where it is in the pantry, and I think, well, I would love to give you some variety, but this is what you're asking for, and it's a lot easier to just give him the applesauce than to try to say no, which I usually just give in. But that's because if he's legitimately hungry and in need, then I have an obligation as his parent to provide for that need. And, sometimes we'll pivot and maybe have some fruit snacks instead. But if he's asking for food, there's usually a reason for it. And I think this concept applies to us as children, to God, our Father, but it requires some humility on our part to admit this. I was given the advice many years ago from this priest in talking about prayer and how to feel more at peace and sort of at right with the prayers being said, how to feel more satisfied and complete. And his advice was shockingly simple, that it still resonates today. And his advice was simply just to ask, to ask Jesus for the good stuff. He had a particular way of saying, ask Jesus for the good stuff. And that really stood out to me, that it, for some reason, seemed like a foreign concept to me of like, why would I ask for like so straightforward? But that really is something that, one, we're like certainly able and allowed to do, and something that we should do. If we can just ask humbly and simply for it, we might be that much easier and more inclined to recognize when the good stuff comes to us. Now we can ask, and again, there's no shame or reason why you can't ask God for the good feelings, the love, the warmth, or the patience to feel more satisfied with our life and how we can live more peaceably into this. And the secret really is, to pray more unassumingly and humbly and gently asking. There's nothing wrong with that at all. The principle for prayer that is frequently talked about is that God He may not give you exactly what you want. He either is going to give it to you, or He's going to give you something better. And that's sort of the carrot dangling out there, because it's hard to see in our daily life what the timeline of that looks like. That's why it can be frustrating if it feels like the prayers are not being answered. I'm reminded of the section in 2 Corinthians when St. Paul is complaining and he says that he's been wounded, he has this pain and he's hurt from Satan. And Paul's praying desperately and earnestly. He prays on 3 separate times. He says, God, will you heal me? Will you help me here? And God says no. He says he will give Paul something better. He plans to use the weakness that Paul was feeling so that Paul could better experience Christ's full gift of grace and power later. And it's a challenge, to be sure, to accept what does come your way and what does not come your way in the time that you're expecting. Again, that's kind of dependent upon your perspective in any given moment. The truth here in recognizing that God will give what is asked or something better, that's in line with this whole idea that everything is in God's hand and it's in His timing. We don't know the full plan. We don't know exactly how we will go, but we're called to trust and to keep praying and asking and living within His presence. And we can continue to trust Him because that's a part of His character. His character of goodness, and we can be confident in His timing and in His watchful hand over our daily lives. And we're tasked to answer with patience and faith in all this. If we look at Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, for example, the line about rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. That's Thessalonians 5:16-18. Which I think is, again, it's a powerful reminder. It's kind of tough to do, but that's something that we're called to try to answer that call. And this is similar Back to the very beginning of this whole section of not judging others and looking positively and thinking well of everyone, this allows you to experience joy, and so too does giving thanks for all that is given and thanks for everything that is around you. And it's hard to remember to do that, but that can shape how you perceive the world around you. And this brings us to the last verse here, verse 12, and the golden rule of doing to others what you would have done to you. This is also found in Luke 6:31. Matthew's account here adds a small line about here hangs all the law and the prophets. This is somewhat emblematic of the summary of the law in Matthew 22 of loving God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and loving your neighbors. The idea that in that context, Christ is telling the Pharisees that this is the entirety of all the law, all 613 commandments summed up into one basic point of loving God and loving neighbor. All of God's command, all of even this sermon revolves around loving God and loving others. And this golden rule here, how it's written, is sort of a measuring stick or a way to sort of check yourself to see if you're on the right track. You know, it's kind of like if you're dividing a brownie between you and your sibling, and you have to divide it, and the sibling gets to choose which one, so you know you got the fairest deal. Although maybe that's not the perfect analogy, but I think the idea is that you have to feel for what the other person would want and how they would feel and what they would desire. And that should guide our actions to see how what you do affects the other person, and if you would be okay with it being flipped around. All this leads us to living more generously and charitably for everyone we meet, which in turn most beautifully opens ourselves up to God, opens our hearts to God, which is a really great and joyful thing. And that's the end of this session. We've looked again in the first portion, verses 1 through 6, looking to love others and think well of them, and how helpful that can be in your daily life. That sort of answers how you are to live. And it makes it easier to love people. Then in the next section, we saw how looking towards loving God and how that informs how we love others as well. We've got one more section next week, concluding chapter 7. I hope your discussions have been blessed. I hope you continue to feel blessed by God's presence in your life. And I hope you can continue to try to love God with all that you have and to answer Christ's call to prayer in his Sermon on the Mount. So I hope you all do well, and God bless each and every one of you. Thank you.